Alright, so this is part 2 of making a custom sleeve. So far we've been working on the rough draft. We're going to continue fine-tuning it, and then eventually I'm going to show you how to cut and sew this in muslin so you could do a fitting with your client. The next thing that we want to do on our sleeve is get the center grain line back. So if you had opened up or closed your sleeve, we're going to want to find the exact middle spot of that. And that's going to be the center line at the top of the cap, and then go back to the original center of the line at the wrist, and then we'll connect this with a straight line. So in order to connect this as a straight line, you'll notice that my ruler is too short. If you have this ruler and only another one of the same size, you can put them side by side to come in here, and you can find a straight line from the inside of this ruler to the outside of that ruler and connect all the way back. Or better yet is if you have a longer ruler, so then you can connect a straight line the whole distance. So this would be the most accurate. So again, this is my new center of the sleeve. So go ahead and on your pattern pieces, get your center line put back in there. Then here at the bicep level, we're going to find where the bicep level intersects at this center of the sleeve. And then I'm going to square up my ruler with that line. And you'll notice here, it's going below the points. So what I'll do is I'll move the ruler down ever so slightly to where I can see the points from the armhole, as well as squaring the ruler up. And I can come back in here and retrue my bicep line. Come down to the elbow, and again, here's the elbow level. And at that level, you're going to want to square this new elbow guideline. And then come back and get your dart. So here's the dart tip. This was one dart leg, so just tracing right off that original dart. You don't need to change anything about it. That's the other dart leg. And circle the dart tip. So now that we have our balance lines on here, we're ready to go ahead and transfer this to a clean new piece of paper. So I need to take my new piece of paper and arrange it so the numbers again are at the top coming down. So if I'm looking at it from this point of view, I'm reading these correctly. Once you've established that, move your sleeve around to where you have a good 2 inches all the way around for later when we add seam allowance. Then take that center of the sleeve and start to align it with a row of numbers. So I'll come up here, I'll circle this row of numbers right here, and then I'll take my ruler and I'll go ahead and draw a straight line, which will be the center of the sleeve. This is also the grain line for cutting your sleeve. Now for me, the easiest way to trace this off is I'll put this sleeve underneath here. And I'll come in and I'll line up the center at the top. And I'll pin it with one little tiny pinch pin right there. So then I'm able to still pivot this pattern piece underneath here. I can pin this now with a longer pin grab, so now it won't shift, and I'll come back up to the top one and I'll fix this so it also has a longer grab, so nothing underneath here will move around. Go ahead and sharpen your pencil again so you have nice, clean, crisp lines. So we're going to come back in here and get our guidelines. Now as I move my ruler over, it's hard to see where that guideline is. So what I'll do is I'll come in here and put a few dots down first, So then as I move my ruler over, I can see those pencil dots clearly. So that's my bicep guideline. We'll come down here for our elbow guideline. Also, I'm making sure that my ruler is square with the dots on the paper. And we'll come down here, we'll get our dart. So this is the dart tip. Circle that. Here's one dart leg. Here's the other dart leg. Boom. Now for the rest of this, because the pattern is underneath here, it has a little thickness. There's a little ridge here. So if you're confident, you can push hard and follow right along that ridge line. But making sure that you're not changing any of the original shape. And then here I can use my ruler, because this is just a straight line. This is the front side. On the back side, remember this is no longer a straight line here because we have a dart. So this line coming up to the dart is different from this line going away from the dart. Also, if you remember, the wrist now is starting to become a curve, which is correct. So go ahead and just follow that original curve, and then we'll keep truing it up later as we go. So just come back, eyeball, make sure everything looks good. And then we can transfer our notches, which actually I've lost my notches from doing all of this taping. And I'm going to draw these in lightly because we still have more chances to fix them. And here's my front notch. So if any of your lines got a little bit weird, you have a chance now to come in and fix those lines so they're smooth curves, especially here on the front where we've taken away that 1/4 inch. Now before I start doing too much more on cleaning this up and truing it up, making everything match, I want to go ahead and walk this cap sleeve again to my slopers. So then if we're still having any kind of issues, we'll fix that right away. So take out your back sloper. And remember, these are right sides up, and we're going to walk this right sides together. So I need this. This is the back of the sleeve. This is the front of the sleeve. So I'm going to walk the back of the sleeve here to my sloper. On the video, it might be hard for you to see, but when you're doing this in person, you'll be able to see it easily. I can see my pencil line behind here. If there's some reason you can't see it, you just need to draw it in darker so you can see all the way through. So I'm matching these two curves here in the armhole, and then right where it's starting to need to pivot is where I have my first two notches. So on mine, my shoulder seam, so this is the shoulder from your sloper, my shoulder is hitting right at top dead center on the sleeve. So again, here's the front half of my cap, here's my front sloper, and I need to match these up along this armhole seam, and it has to be right sides together. So I'm going to flip this over, and I'm matching up right where the two armholes are going to start sewing. And also the curve is matching for the first few inches here. And right before I need to start pivoting to walk this sleeve, I have my notch right here. So now if I walked the armhole for the front. So the front comes right up to here. And you can see I have this space. The front ended here, the back ended here, and I have this space here. That's that 1/2 inch that I wanted to add for ease. Now, lucky for me, when I split this 1/2 inch difference in half, this is going to be my notch for the sleeve itself. What we want to do is, we were always working there from the back, but we want to transfer this to the front. So take a look at where that shoulder notch landed and go ahead and bring that to the front of your pattern piece. And then here I want to review what we just did from the front. The back walked to top dead center. The front came up 1/2 inch short. In between those two, I found my mark. And then this mark is 1/4 inch towards the front. And that will become my notch for where the two shoulders meet when you're sewing the sleeve. And again, you want it slightly forward of this line. Will make the sleeve slightly tilt on the body, which is actually more comfortable with your arm and your elbow bending forward. So if your shoulder notch was 1/4 inch forward from top dead center, then you're fine. Everything's good to go. But what I want to do is I want to show you some problem solving for people whose notches are too far forward or too far backwards. Now let's take a look at your results. If your back walked up beyond center front and your front came up short, and halfway between those your shoulder notch was still 1/2 inch forward, to resolve this, what we need to do is, on our front bodice sloper, we need to take away 1/8 of an inch in the middle of the armhole, going back to 0 at the side seam and 0 at the shoulder. And then we need to add 1/8 of an inch to the middle of the armhole on the back, going back to 0 at the side seam and 0 at the shoulder. I would practice this on paper first before I actually cut my oak tag slopers. And then you'll see that the shoulder notch will rotate towards the back, so we have 1/4 inch away from the center. All right, so the other example I want to review, the next one that I want to work on is for people whose shoulder notch was too far backwards. So if your front walked up, so let's say you walked your front bodice or maybe even slightly beyond and it came up somewhere close to the center of the sleeve, and then your back piece and then when you walk the back slope, and when you split the difference between fairly short of center, we were getting a shoulder notch that's 1/4 inch. We're going to end up with a shoulder notch that's 1/4 of an inch backwards. So what you're going to want to do is, on your slopers, you're going to want to so what you're going to want to do in this instance from the you're going to want to take away 1/4 of an inch from the center of the armhole. Again, this is at the center, and you're going to want to add 1/4 inch to the front. And then what you're going to notice is, the shoulder notch will go from being too far backwards to rotating up to being 1/4 of an inch forward from center, and this is correct. And of course, you're going to want to practice this on paper first before you cut your actual slopers. So now that I have my armhole has a nice fluid curve all the way through, the double notches on the back, single notch on the front, match to my slopers. As well, I walk the back up to here, the front up to there, and I had 1/2 of an inch extra ease, which is correct. And then I split the difference of the two, and I have my notch for the shoulder, which is forward of the center grain line. So everything on this is correct now. So once you've established that, the next part that we're on to is the dart. We want to fold this dart, and then we're going to match up these two, the length from here to here and the length from here to here, and we're also going to make this a straight clean line to sew up with the underarm sleeve here. So starting from the wrist, coming up towards your dart, the very first dart leg is the one that we're going to fold towards us. Then we're going to fold our pattern piece right to the dart tip. So then we can take this dart leg and fold it upwards towards the other dart leg. And what this is doing is, on the inside, the allowance from the dart is going downwards with gravity. Also, as you put your arm into your sleeve, your hand won't catch on the dart because it's going downwards. Once you've closed the dart, you'll notice the underarm seam has a sharp angle stair step right here. In using the least amount of curve possible from your French curve, you want to come in here and draw a clean connection between those two. So it's a smooth transition going over that elbow dart. Now if you haven't done it already, go ahead on the wrong side of this paper, draw in your center of the sleeve grain line. So then we can reference it here from the back side. What we're going to do is, the side of the sleeve that has the elbow dart, we're going to go ahead and fold this right on, right along this underarm seam. And you'll have to fold one side separate from the other side. In order to get this to transition, you'll clip the paper, so then I can come in here and fold this other side of the underseam. So now we can see here's the underseam of our sleeve and the transition at the elbow. Then I want to bring this towards the middle of our pattern piece. Again, this is all wrong side up. So then I can fold this other side on the underseam of the sleeve and fold that in. So now what we're able to do is we're able to see, when you sew the sleeve together, how well is the sleeve walking all the way to the wrist. So starting from where the armholes meet, I can tape that together, walk this down to the elbow, and where the elbow darts come together, I can put a notch onto the front of the sleeve. So I can see that at the wrist level, they're not quite matching up. They're slightly off. And what I want to do is, I want to blend these together. So I'm going to start here and then move my tool over until I can see a nice blend between the two. So now we know that the wrist is going to connect all the way through. Nice, clean, even circumference at the wrist. So here you're able to start seeing what the sleeve looks like. This is the underarm seam, the top of the sleeve with the grain line. This is the cap where her shoulder will be. And then back in here you have the elbow dart. And you're starting to notice the shape of the sleeve now is starting to curve towards the front. So this would be a natural, how a person naturally stands with her elbows bending slightly towards the front. This is also a chance where if you were making a sleeve for yourself, make sure that you can get your arm all the way inside that sleeve, all the way up to the wrist part. Alright, so let's talk about getting this ready to start adding seam allowance. Over here where we clipped the paper, so we were able to transition between the two curved lines. We need to have that taped perfectly back into place. And then leaving your dart closed, so it's still taped closed, what we're going to do is we're going to add our seam allowance. So I'm going to add 1/2 inch going back into the dart, remembering that the dart has a slight curve to it through the dart area. And then back out to here, it's a straight line. But stop before you get to the wrist. So leave this paper down here at the wrist. So after I've cut out the dart, now I can release the dart, and you'll notice that the dart will make a shaping here into the seam allowance. And we also want to continue the dart legs all the way through the seam allowance, because this is going to be our notches. So this is our notches for the dart legs. Now down here at the wrist, what we want to do is we want to add 1 inch seam allowance. Keep in mind that this is a curve, so you're going to follow your 1 inch along the curve. We can add 1/2 inch to the underarm from the front side of the sleeve. And down here at this 1 inch seam allowance, there's going to be a little more added on when we do a single fold coming backwards. So what I like to do is, if you turn this wrist over, so now for the first part of the wrist, you can come in and fold it, just worrying about the first inch of that wrist curve. Go ahead and fold this. And when you start to cut the 1/2 inch seam allowance and unfold that, you're going to see it added to the pattern piece, and you want that extra little bit there. It's going to be a 1 inch hem. You need to have that little extra fabric on there to meet up with the raw edges. So do the same thing on the other side as well. Again, here's my notch, and this is the notch that will match up to the two dart legs closed on this side. So what I want to do is I want to get rid of this balance line from the elbow in the seam allowance, and I want to take this notch, and I'm going to have my pencil here on the notch, and I'm going to square my ruler up with the underarm seam, and then I'll draw my notch in here. So this is right angles, right angles. Now up here at the sleeve cap, what I'm going to do is add seam allowance. But again, where we have the bicep guideline going into the seam allowance, I'm going to erase that. And when I start adding seam allowance, if I start here following the curve and I move down into the seam allowance, I have my curve of the seam allowance, and then I'll continue on. But here where I have my two notches, for the area that they're at, we want them to square into the seam allowance. So if you can imagine taking your ruler and squaring it with just the first part of that curve, then you can draw your and here at the top of the sleeve, what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase the grain line. Here's another way of squaring your notch into the seam allowance. If I were to take my ruler and I were to put it on that notch and move it out into the seam allowance here, so my center of my ruler is matching right where that notch is, I can look at the shape of the curve here and the shape of the curve here and make sure it has an even balance to it. And once I've established that it looks even on both sides, I can put a dot here, and that would be square for the notch according to the curve. Bring this out to the edge of the seam allowance, and then I will move my ruler accordingly so I'm getting an even distance of the curve on both sides. So then I know I'm pretty much straight out, and then I can get my notch. So again, it will be square according to that little section of the curve. So again, I've cut off all of the seam allowance all the way around for the sake of this demo so you can see the shape of the sleeve. A lot of times I'll just leave paper on here and eventually I'll cut along the seam allowance also while I'm cutting through my fabric. But when you are doing this, when you shape the dart, you do have to cut that with your scissors to get this dart shaping. And when you're shaping down in the wrist, you do need to do your folds and cut the seam allowance with your scissors on paper in order to find the shaping of your seam allowance. So let's talk about labeling now. This center guideline is also the grain of the fabric. So go ahead and put your arrow tips touching right to the seam and darken them in. And it's right here along the center line. I'm going to go ahead and erase it down here in the seam allowance so it's not confusing to be a notch. So that becomes our grain line. Then what I want to put on here is the information for my pattern piece. So I put a box on the grain line, and inside of there is the size of my pattern piece. So I'm working with size 6. I'm going to put on here sleeve, my name, and the date. Also, we want to put the information on here on what you're cutting. So this is going to be cut to main body. The elbow dart, make sure you circle that. Also later on we're going to put a hole punch through there. And then for the bicep line, just for the sake of having a horizontal balance line, this could be your HBL at bicep, and down at the elbow would be your HBL at elbow. So I'm just cleaning it up a little more. I put back on the back side of the sleeve, front on the front. This is just for us as a beginning pattern maker to remember which is which, but obviously having the notches here, you will always know that this is the back with the double notch and front with the single notch. As well, when you're drafting a sleeve right side up, this is for your wearer's right side of her body, so this would also be the sleeve front and back because you already know it's for the right side of the body. The next video is part 3, where we're going to transfer this to muslin. We're going to cut and sew it and attach it back to our muslin bodice so we can do a test fit on your dress form or with your client.